Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Premiership Quarter. Today, I'm going to be doing my power rankings for round 4 of the 2024 AFL season. I'm going to be doing this throughout the year after every 4 rounds, technically 5, given we had opening round this year as a new idea, and giving my thoughts on where I ranked each team in the ladder, you could call it, talking about how they've gone this year and where I have them ranked against other teams. So, with that said, let's get it underway. So, I'm going to start from 18th and then work my way up to first. And in 18th position, I have North Melbourne. I think they have been the worst performing team. They said at the start of the year and during preseason that they wanted to play a brand of football called North Ball. And they were hyping it up. And during the preseason, they showed a little bit of it. But so far, we haven't actually seen it, and they've been pretty disappointing as a team so far this year. They in round 1 they lost by 40 points in a relatively solid effort against GWS, who's a pretty good team. They also lost a solid game against Fremantle where they were up by about 5 goals early in the game, and then lost during the second half poorly to Fremantle. They conceded runs. They lost by almost 10 goals to Carlton, and they've lost by 70 now to Brisbane in gather round. I just think that they have been performing poorly, and we'll get on to the next team. I have them slightly above because they've been able to show that they can challenge certain teams. And in 17th spot, I have West Coast. These two love to be married next to each other on every single ladder you do. Look at any stat, they're always bottom two together. The reason I've got West Coast slightly above North Melbourne is because I think they've performed slightly better in their most recent outing. They've also played some really good teams. They've lost to Port Adelaide in Adelaide. They lost to GWS. They've lost to the Bulldogs in a poor performance, yes, but they also only just lost to Sydney, who are one of the better teams so far this year, in what was a pretty good performance. Their older players so far have stayed relatively healthy. They've shown to be able to still provide at an AFL level. You've got McGovern, you've got Yo, you've got Kelly. They're still able to perform. And I think that with the younger side in North Melbourne, they've struggled a bit more, and the weaknesses are a bit clearer in North Melbourne's game compared to West Coast. So that's why I have West Coast slightly above North Melbourne. Then in 16th, I think this is a slightly reactionary take, but I've got Adelaide. They haven't performed well in almost any of their games, yet they've only lost by 35 at worst, which was against Fremantle in round 3. They've lost to Gold Coast by 6, where they came back in the last quarter, Geelong by 19, and Melbourne by 15. They've lost both of their home games against teams. One team you would say is definitively above them, and the other you would say around them, which is Geelong. They've also lost away to both Gold Coast and Fremantle, who were teams in and around them, and they've just been really, really poor. Their midfield has not fired at all. Their forwards have struggled early on. Rochelle hasn't been able to get in games. Walker hasn't hit the heights he did last year. They haven't had Thilthorpe this year. Fogarty hasn't taken that jump that some people expected. And they've also been able to be susceptible to teams quickly scoring like certain teams have against them, like a Geelong and like a Melbourne, because their backline still hasn't developed properly, which is why I have them 16th. They've played tougher opponents than West Coast and North, but they also haven't been able to get a single win against any of them. So that's why I have them 16th. In 15th, I have Hawthorn. It's a similar story where they just haven't been able to get a win this year. They've played Essendon, lost by 4 goals. They played Melbourne, where it was a really poor performance, and they lost by 9 goals. By 6 goals to Geelong, and they only just lost in gather round to Collingwood. So their results after the Melbourne game have gotten better. They fought pretty hard against Geelong, and it was a close game in the end. The scoreboard didn't feel like how the game was playing out in a sense. And then they very, very pushed Collingwood all the way to the end. They came back from 38 down, but their team just isn't as talented as what it could be. A lot of that's due to injury. They haven't been able to field the best team they can, which is why they are low. But I also think they've been able to challenge like Adelaide and like West Coast haven't on a consistent basis. They've kept most games at close or within reaching distance. And I just feel like Adelaide have either pushed, which is why the score's so close, or they haven't actually been good enough within games to be above Hawthorn. In 14th, I have a relatively reactionary take as well. I have Essendon. They started relatively well. They beat Hawthorn by 4 goals, as I just talked about in my Hawthorn take. They went up to Sydney and lost by 5 goals in a decent performance. They were within a couple goals, and then Sydney were just able to kick a few late to extend the margin. They came back against St Kilda in a game where St Kilda really lost it, rather than Essendon actually winning it and deserving to win it. And then they just got blown out by 69 points against Port Adelaide. They have said they wanted to play with an Essendon edge, and we haven't seen it. Their midfield just got battered, and that should be one of their strengths. They've got Merritt, Parrish, Setterfield, Hobbs, Sardis, who are able to play there, and they just haven't performed so far this year. And I think it's been a pretty disappointing season so far for Essendon, even though they have a 2-2 ledger. In 13th spot, I have Richmond. They are 1-3 so far to start the year, and they've actually been not too bad in a lot of their games. Gold Coast, they got obliterated in the first half and made it an okay margin, but that was also without a lot of their best players. They returned against Carlton and they pushed them to within a goal and very nearly won it right at the end. And so that's a good performance as well for them. Then they went to the MCG and lost by 5 goals to Port Adelaide, where they really put it up to Port Adelaide. They got within a goal at 3/4 time, and they just couldn't have the energy in the last quarter to be able to withstand Port Adelaide, who are still a really good team. Then they actually beat Sydney, who, yes, have dipped in form compared to their first 3 rounds, and it is a good buy for them now. But they're still a good team. They've had one of the best performing players in Isaac Heaney, Errol Goulden, Chad Warner. There's still a lot of talent. And then they also took it up to St Kilda, another finals team. And so they've played some good talented teams so far this year, and they took it up to them, which is why I have them above the likes of Essendon and above the likes of Hawthorn, even though they've only won one game. In 12th spot, I have the runners up from last year, being the Brisbane Lions. They've struggled to start the year. I think that's pretty fair to say, but they were able to get a really good win to be able to hopefully play back into form against North Melbourne. They played Carlton round one and only just lost up in the Gabba. So the first time they lost in over a year up there, which is a bit disappointing. Then they travelled to Freo and lost by 4 goals to what's shown to be a pretty good defensive side in Fremantle. They should have beat Collingwood up at the Gabba. I thought it was very disappointing there. And then they've now, obviously, as I said, beaten North Melbourne. They've played some really good sides, so you've got to give it to them that it's not been easy to start the year. But I'd say in 3 of those games, they would have started favourites. The Collingwood one is essentially a 50-50, and Collingwood were probably in a more dire situation, so needed the win more. But they're now at a 1-3 ledger and probably don't have too much margin of error to be able to go on if they want to either make finals at bare minimum or even challenge for prelim week. They need to finish at least with 3 less wins by the end of the year. I don't think they can go 15-7 or 16-7. I think they need to make top 4 to be able to go back. A few of their players have underperformed, as I was talking about in my round of review. Their forward line hasn't been able to hit the same heights as it did last year, and they've really struggled in their midfield being able to get some burst and some actual damage from the stoppage, which is why I have them in 12th on my power rankings. In 11th, I've got the reigning premiers, which is cool to see them back to back. They've played some tough teams as well. They played GWS in opening round. Then they went on to go and lose to Sydney by just over 5 goals in a really, really poor performance. Then they lost to St Kilda by 15. And then they've just beaten Brisbane up at the Gabba, like I said, and they just beat Hawthorn in gather round by 5 points. So they're now at a ledger of 2-3, and hopefully they can build off this momentum. But as I said, it's tough teams. It's GWS and Sydney, 2 teams that were really, really pushing at the start of the year. Sydney have sort of fallen back a little bit, but GWS are still there. right at the top. St Kilda, another finals team, and then obviously Brisbane up at the Gabba, being a really, really tough team. But they're now 2-3, and they should be able to build off the back of this and get to the point where they're making finals, if not top four, again for the third year running. In 10th position, I have the St Kilda Saints, and they are starting 2-2. They played Geelong at GMHBA and lost by 8 points. They beat Collingwood at the MCG by 15, as I just mentioned. They lost to Essendon by 4 points, and they've beat Richmond by 7 points in gather round. So a lot of close games. They've only got a point differential of plus 10 for the season. So it just shows how indecisive and how inconsistent they have been so far this year. Haven't kicked accurately in all but one game. They've been very in and out of games as well. So this first half of the Essendon game, they were very, very good, just weren't able to put it on the scoreboard. And then the second half of the Richmond game, they were also very good. They've played so far two good teams and two lower teams, and which is why I've tried to put them as middle as possible, because they haven't been good, but I don't think they've been bad either. In ninth position, I have the Gold Coast Suns. They have been, I think, pretty good so far this year. They're 2-2 at the moment. Beat Richmond really convincingly in opening round. Beat Adelaide in round one by 6 points. Then they got smashed by the Doggies by 8 goals and just lost in a really good manner. You could call it, against GWS by 5 goals. They have played a couple good teams and a couple of lower teams. A lot of the three of the teams I'd say were in their rankings, and they went 2-1 against those teams. So that's a good result for them. I wouldn't put them in the 8, I'll call it, so far, because I just don't think they've been able to be better than 2-2. I think 2-2 is a fair result. And they showed that against a team like the Bulldogs, they can struggle, which just shows a bit of their inexperience. Now we enter the top 8 for my power rankings, and that starts with number 8, and that is going to be the Western Bulldogs. They lost quite poorly in round 1 to Melbourne by 45 points. They beat the Suns then in round 2 by 8 goals in Ballarat. They destroyed West Coast by 76 points, and then they just lost to Geelong by 4 points in gather round. Their midfield has probably been their strongest line so far this year. They've had Libba, Bont, and Trelaw all have really good years. They've been able to recover the loss of Bailey Smith quite well. Riley Sanders has performed pretty good in his debut season so far. Harvey Gallagher has been pretty good as well. And Luke Beveridge has shown that some of his weird decisions have been able to pay off, not playing McRae, not playing Daniel in their positions consistently, and then going with a couple of the younger players has paid off. It's given the team a bit more energy, but they have been a bit inconsistent. They've only beaten two teams that, talent-wise, you would say is lower than them. They've probably played a really good game against Geelong, who was right next to them, I'd say, in terms of where they were expected to be at the start of the year. And then they've lost to a team that I would say would be above them by a really disappointing margin in 45 points to the Demons, which is why I only have them in 8th. In 7th, I have Sydney. This team probably would have been closer to top 4 had this have been a week ago or even 2 weeks ago, but they've just slightly started to fade a little bit. Their midfielders haven't had that same burst that they did in the first 3 rounds, which is understandable. They're not all pure midfielders. They need the likes of Mills, of Parker, of Adams to get back. They've also started to fade defensively. Melican and Rampy have started to struggle. McCartan has been the rock, as I said he would be, but they've just started to fade a little bit, and their forwards, their tall forwards specifically, haven't hit the same strides that some people thought they would. They've beat the Demons by 22 in opening round. They beat the Pies by 33 at the G. They beat the Bombers by 30 at the SCG. Lost to the Tigers by 5, and then only just squeezed past the Eagles in gather round. So they've definitely started to fade, but they've still beat 2 really good teams. And then they lost against a decent Tigers outfit just before they were struck really with injuries, which is why I don't have them in the top 4. In 6th, I have Port Adelaide. They beat West Coast by 50, Tigers by 30, lost to the Demons by 7, and just beat the Bombers by 70. They've beat three teams who are quite comfortably below them and have only just lost to a team around their margins in Melbourne. And so having them about where they were finishing last year in sixth, I think is fair. I've got them below who I have in five being Melbourne, just because they've lost to them. I don't think there's too much difference. Melbourne have played an extra game, but then they've also only lost the same amount and only one more game. So in terms of who they've played, it's probably going to be similar by the time the bye rounds finish early on. So that's why I have Port Adelaide 6th. And as I said, I've got Melbourne 5th. They lost to the Swans by 22, beat the Dogs by 45, beat the Hawks by 55, beat the Power by 7, and the Crows by 15. So they've won 4 in a row and are in really good form. But 3 of those 4 teams have not been very good. The Crows are in really, really poor form. The Hawks aren't healthy at the moment, and so their best team is not on the park. And then the Dogs are in and around the making finals mark rather than pushing for the top 4 as the same spot as Melbourne. So that's why I don't have them breaking into the top 4. All 3 of their lines are playing really, really well at the moment. Their back line, their middle, and their forward line. But I heard from Champion Data today that they're taking the most difficult shots in the competition. And as we've seen in the last couple of years, they have started early in the season kicking accurately, and they do often fade late, which is the problem last year. And so it's just whether they can keep it up this year, but I don't think they will. Now, top 4 in fourth, I have got Fremantle. They've beat the Lions by 23, beat North by 26, the Crows by 35, and have lost to the Blues by 10. They beat a decent Lions team in round 1 for them. It was a really good win. Not a lot of people expected Fremantle to do it. Not a lot of people expected Fremantle to be 3-1 so far this season. They beat 2 teams who, one of them was definitely below them, one of them was probably in the same bracket as them heading into the season. North by 26, Crows by 35. 2 good wins. They've been able to come back in games, show real spirit, and then again on the weekend, they were probably the better team for most of the game, but just got a couple of unfortunate decisions against them, which is why they lost to Carlton. Top 3, starting off with 3, I have Carlton, just as I mentioned, got a very lucky win against Fremantle with a couple of umpiring decisions going their way, touched and a couple of dissent calls. They beat North Melbourne by 56 on Good Friday, beat the Tigers by 5 and beat the Lions by 1. So at the moment, they're the king of the close games, taken that over from Collingwood. They've had a couple close games, and they've been really good at that in the last 10 weeks in terms of actual games. They've been able to get good win over North Melbourne, where their forwards were really, really potent. But they probably shouldn't have necessarily beat Fremantle. I don't think they were the better team. It was probably an undeserved win, some would call it. And that's why I only have them third, even though they are undefeated. In second, I have GWS. They have been undefeated to start the year. They beat the Pies by 32 points, beat North Melbourne by 39, beat West Coast by 65, and Gold Coast by 28. The only reason I don't have them being number 1 is because of their opponents. They've beat North Melbourne and West Coast. They beat Gold Coast, who weren't necessarily in their range at all, and they beat a really disappointing Pies outfit in opening round, and that's what holds them back from being first, which I have, if you couldn't tell already, Geelong. They've been undefeated this year to start. They beat the Saints by 8 at GMHBA, beat the Crows by 19 points, beat the Hawks, and beat the Dogs by 36 points and 4 points, respectively. They haven't been the best teams, but I'd say Saints, Crows, Hawks, and Dogs have probably been better teams than the Pies, North, West Coast, and Dogs so far. They've also done this without Patrick Dangerfield to start the year with a couple of games missing. He got injured during the Crows game, so they've been able to beat the Hawks and the Dogs without Dangerfield, which is why I have them first. They've got arguably the best coach in the league. They've got a great team up and down. They don't necessarily have the most talent in the middle, but they're able to get so much out of players like Bruin, out of Bowes, out of Parfitt. Brian Myers has had an excellent season to start. Jeremy Cameron hasn't necessarily hit the scoreboard as much as you might have thought, but he's been involved in everything they do, and he's been really, really good so far this year, which is why I have them first. So that's going to be the end of the video. If you like the video, please hit the like button. It'll really help push the video in the YouTube algorithm. Leave your thoughts in the comments below about where you think each team would rank against each other. If you enjoy this type of content, please hit the subscribe button. It'll really help push my channel and spread it and help me. And thanks for watching.